today we're going to do a lecture on elite intellectual culture in 18th century America. You know, specifically, we're going to look at the Enlightenment, this European intellectual, social, and cultural movement among their intellectual elites and actual money social elites, and how it's important to America, what it means to elites in America in the 18th century. Okay? The first thing I want to talk about is the literate nature of the British colonies, the American British colonies in the 18th century. You know, by the mid-18th century, the British colonies were, in what will become the continental United States, were probably the most literate society on the planet. Right? There's no hard and fast statistics to prove this, but we do know their literacy rates pretty well. It is estimated that for the colonies as a whole, literacy rates for men were 90%. That's 90% of men who lived in the colonies could read. Women, for the colonies as a whole, was about 40%, right? I mean, there's still that gender inequality in education. However, that's not for all the colonies. In New England, literacy rates for women were fairly comparable to those as men, and they're around 90%. And in either case, let's just put it by way of comparison, England at this time, for society as a whole, men and women, the literacy rate is around 30%. Okay, so we have in the New England colonies, 90% men and women, 90% of men throughout all of the colonies could read by the middle of the 18th century. You know, England, which is a fairly modern and progressing society at that time, 30% of the people could read. And there's a couple reasons for this, right? One of the biggest reasons is, of course, that in the colonies, right, we see the real triumph of the heart of the Protestant Reformation, right? The colonies in the 18th century have a very distinctive Protestant character, right? Religion isn't intense everywhere. You know, New England has a different history than Virginia, but nonetheless, that sort of penetration, the idea of being able to read scripture in the common tongue for all people being the essence of spirituality had meaning, right? In New England, since the 1640s, you know, they had public education in every town. In some towns, they taught how to read Latin and English to both men and women. So that's part of that. We have this very literate society in the colonies. Now, the other question is, what did they read, right? What were they reading? Well, for most colonists, if they owned any books at all, now I want to say something about books. To actually have a book, a bound book, was an expensive item. They weren't common, right? They are much more expensive. Most of the book printers are in Europe. Most of the writing comes out of Europe at this time, so it's something you had to import. They're actually a luxury item in many ways, right? So that much of the reading that's happening for anyone isn't books. It's pamphlets, it's newspapers, it's letters. It's things that were cheaper and quicker and easier to produce and disperse. But there is a book culture in the colonies as a whole. And for even common people, there are two books you could find in most households, right? One book is an obvious one. I wouldn't even have to tell you. You could guess. It's the Bible, right? And of course, this goes hand in hand with what I already said. The whole reason they could read in the first place, or that there was a societal, cultural pressure to be able to read, other than the sort of participation in a global economy that many people are involved in the colonies in the 18th century. But it's the Reformation. It's the ability to read the Bible. Even if you couldn't read the Bible, chances are you probably owned one as a family, right? So the Bible is certainly part, and Scripture is part of maybe not everyday life in terms of them reading it, but it's something they would have. The second book, and you might be able to guess this too with just a little thinking about it, is the Farmer's Almanac, an almanac, right? And listen, 90% of people in the colonies are involved in agrarian pursuits. They're farmers, they run plantations, or they work on farms and plantations, right? They care a great deal about farming and how to make things grow better, weather cycles. And I want to say a little bit about the almanac. In fact, this is true in the times of the 18th century, and it's actually true now about the almanac, actually. While the almanac had certain elements of improving scientific knowledge, they could predict moon cycles pretty well, they had a good understanding of astronomy, and you would find things like that in the almanac. There would be shared advice on growing techniques, new styles and tools, and there would be advertising to buy new tools and stuff, right, in the almanac. There is a practical, technological, and scientifically advanced part of the almanac. However, a great deal of the almanac, then and now, was actually based on long-standing folklore, superstition, traditional ideas about planting, like they would say, what was the best full moon to plant a certain type of wheat in to get better yields, right? The whole weather prognostication wasn't based on some sort of new understanding of weather. As a matter of fact, they used very old-fashioned folklore. Fat furry animals showing up in the middle of summer says, or woolly caterpillars, the sort of stuff our grandparents sometimes still say to us, right? That idea of sort of superstition, myth, and folklore conditioning expectations is in the Farmer's Almanac, right? And it's not surprising, an agrarian people at once could be both pragmatic in their needs and desires to produce market goods through their farming efforts, and yet they still do hold on to a lot of traditional knowledge that just appealed to them. In some ways, the almanac, was no more scientific than the Bible that they owned too. Like the two of them, in many ways, appeal to similar traditional patterns of expectations and beliefs. And that is most of the book world of most of the colonies, right? That accounts for 80 to 90% of the people who could read in the colonies. And they're not who we're going to talk about today. The people I want to talk about today are actually the elite members of the colonies, that wealthier class. If you can remember when we did the social pyramid and the hierarchy, the people in that top 10%, maybe 15%, but mostly in that top 10%. And not even all the wealthy people. It was probably maybe 30 to 40% of people within that group participated in a particularly vibrant, book-driven intellectual culture that we're going to try to recapture today. It was somewhat geographically specific as well. While there were certainly a number of wealthy planters, educated planters, who engaged in this particular intellectual book culture, men like Jefferson, right? Overwhelmingly, this is the elite intellectual culture of people who lived in the dynamic seaboard cities, right? Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, and later Savannah, right? These are the cities, the ones most engaged in global trade. This is where you're going to find a more dynamic, European-looking colonial elite culture. Okay, so that's really who we're talking about. Before I go any further, I want to make sure that we're clear. I'm not talking about a majority. I'm not even necessarily talking about a significant minority in terms of the numbers. But I am talking about what I believe is, especially when we understand how the society of 18th century colonies worked, a very influential minority. And trying to capture their intellectual world is of great value, certainly for understanding the revolution and what follows the revolution. I should say, books. Coming back to this idea of books, most of the books that the elite culture would read were printed in Europe. They were written by Europeans, particularly the French. English and Scottish thinkers are people they are very much focused on at this time. And as I said, books are actually expensive. It's a luxury item. To own a number of books is actually a sign somewhat of conspicuous consumption. This very status-conscious, upwardly mobile, wealthy elite in these seaboard cities who are trying to establish themselves as sort of a new world nobility, right? Very much wanted you to know the books that they bought. In their homes, they built libraries for the first time. They would collect books. They would share books amongst one another. They would want to know what the other elites in other cities were reading so they could talk about them and show that they were up to date. Some of this is not driven by pure intellectual curiosity, but mostly by a certain amount of status consciousness and a desire to belong to an emerging elite cultural identity. What is important to note is that this emerging identity is transcolonial. And this is very important because as we look at the 18th century, we have to start to find these points where the colonists stop being completely provincial, thinking about themselves as only someone who lives in this city or only in this region or colony, but they saw themselves as part of a larger, I don't want to say American identity, but certainly a transcolonial identity, that they began to share a culture and a communication and an energy with people like themselves, or they saw like themselves, in cities and colonies much further away. And this elite intellectual culture is certainly part of this. So what did they read? Well, one of the things they did read, and it's not necessarily the focus today, but it is important. You know, this is post-Renaissance, post-humanism. Most of these guys were actually going to these new colleges that had been founded in the colonies, and they would be well steeped in the classics, right? And they did love them passionately. They would buy and read them. Cicero, Roman histories, orations, Greek philosophy, Greek theater, right? All of the sort of the classics that had been rediscovered during the Renaissance had become fairly foundational for elite educated culture. And they found great meaning and inspiration in these. They did. It was part of the sort of common tongue among them to be able to talk about these authors, what they said, how they viewed the world, fairly casually and colloquially with one another, right? It's sort of a badge of belonging to this group. But there's another group of books, even larger and more significant, and by the middle of the 18th century, 1750s and 1760s, are really at the heart of this book culture, the sort of passionate, vibrant center of it. And that is books from a slew of new thinkers who are philosophers and scientists and political theorists. And they mostly were men, elite men themselves, noblemen who were educated in Scotland, England, and France would be the main three areas, though Germans and the Dutch are involved as well. But Scotland, England, France are really where the heart of this is. And you know, the writing and the thinking and the spirit of the times, this intellectual elite culture that erupts on both sides of the Atlantic, in both Europe and America, is called the Enlightenment, right? Historians and everyone now basically refers to this period starting in the late 17th century and running through most of the 18th century. We call it the Enlightenment. And we're going to spend a little time talking about what is the Enlightenment? Like, what does it specifically mean? Well, here's what the Enlightenment added that was new. Basically, in the 18th century, we see a sort of new fascination and obsession with rational thinking. Now, there'd been other rationalists and rational thinking, right? This goes back to the Greeks. What the Enlightenment thinkers add to their sort of passion for reason is empirical observation. Empirical observation. That means, empiricism means, you know, anything I can observe through my senses and measure, right? So that if I can observe it, I can measure it, I can catalog it, you know, understanding things through phenomenal experience. Empirical observation, human reason and experience, and math. Those three things linked together, and only those three things, right, could be used to understand the entire universe. Every aspect of it, from how nature worked, to why we have the governments we have, to why do we pray to the gods that we do, everything could be understood through these means. The elite thinkers of Europe, and when I say elite thinkers, they were both elite in terms of they were incredibly knowledgeable men, well-educated, and they were elite. This was a movement at first among the noble classes, the landed gentry, and it extended into the wealthier classes and the upwardly mobile of European cities for sure. But it is definitely elite in terms of both the caliber of what they're thinking about and the books they're producing, and elite socially. Is that they really put forth this idea that through, and I'm going to restate kind of what I've already said just so we have it clearly, that through individual human reason and logic, coupled with empirical observation, the laws of nature and the universe could be understood And more importantly, and this is really important for understanding the Western tradition and what the Enlightenment brings to it, not only could they be understood, they could be manipulated. Once you understand how the laws of nature work using reason and observation and math, you can manipulate them. You can change them. You could and you could manipulate them for the benefit of human society, right? We can make humans and the society we live in better through not only understanding it, but using that understanding practically to manipulate it, right? There's an end goal to this knowledge. It's not just knowledge for knowledge itself. There's an activism that is linked with Enlightenment thinking, right? So it goes beyond much of what came before. Listen, Greek rationalism and all sorts of scientism had always existed, right? But as this really larger transnational, transcolonial embracing of these ideas, human reason, math, and empirical observation to understand and unpack the world and the universe, and then to take that knowledge to manipulate or work within these laws we now understand to improve civilization, to improve the people who live within it, that's new. That's wholly new. And this new print culture and this transatlantic print culture really helps foster it. Fundamental to the Enlightenment, much like fundamental to Greek rationalism thousands of years before, is skepticism. All knowledge begins with doubt. And this is really where the Enlightenment as a style of thinking or a style of culture has great import for the revolutions that we'll see at the end of the 18th century. Skepticism and doubt. You doubt all traditional explanations for why things are the way they are. You doubt the religious explanations, mythological explanations, even supposed scientific or social explanations. And not just for science and nature, for why does the king get to be the king? Why are some people elevated above others, right? Why do we have the economy we have, right? Any of these sort of questions, they began with doubt. That I doubt what you tell me the reason is for why things are the way they are. I doubt that, right? And then I move from that doubt, rejecting what came before, using my own capacity for human reason, maybe math and experience, and certainly observation. Maybe not as always detailed observation. They're not all equally steeped in the scientific method, but that idea is there, that I use the real world experience that I can observe and measure and mix it all up and come up with my own understanding of those natures and explanation for why things are the way they are. And then I have to put forth some idea, or somebody else takes my idea and thinks about how we can improve things based on that. It's often been said that the Enlightenment is sometimes called not only the age of reason, for obvious reasons, it's also called the age of optimism, the age of optimism. And this is somewhat, again, one of our favorite words in this course, paradoxical. You know, the 18th century, depending on what aspect of the 18th century in Europe that you look at, you could say it was anything but a period of optimism, right? The 18th century sets off a period of unremitting, widespread nation-state war that just continually expands and expands and expands, right? Europe is war-torn, and it is a period of the great expansion of slavery. It's a period of lots of different things that are oppressive and destructive. And it always depends, as a historian, as an observer of anything, where you put your gaze will be how you interpret that aspect of history. In fact, it somewhat tells us something about the historian or the individual, what their thinking is, what their politics are, what their philosophical morality is, depending on what they want to observe in history. That being said, it is true. During this period of time, among this elite group of nobles and those who read them, and certainly those who were inspired by them in the New World, they are optimistic, because embedded in this idea of doubt and using reason and observation to understand the natural world and the political world and the spiritual world, right, is the ability to improve it, to use knowledge productively for humanity. And in fact, that as a moral goal and a philosophical goal get wedded during this time. And that is a very optimistic approach to knowledge. And most of the Enlightenment thinkers share this idea. And it should be noted that most of these Enlightenment thinkers are among the leading classes of Europe and certainly of the New World colonies, of the American colonies. And so it is this period of optimism right? That you could more than ever before. By the middle of the 18th century, there's this growing sensibility that you could shape your environment. By shaping the environment, you could change society and the people who live within it for the better. And that's a key idea to the Enlightenment, another concept I want you to have. It's something called environmentalism. Environmentalism. And before I go any further, this is not to be conflated or confused with the contemporary political activist movement of environmentalism about preserving landscapes and endangered species acts. I mean, that's all. It is a definition of environmentalism. But when the Enlightenment guys talked about environmentalism, they were talking about something quite different. Basically, it's a foundational idea of the Enlightenment. It's that an individual is a product of their society, right? Just like an animal is a product of its ecology, right? And we're all products of our surrounding community, our ecology, the government we live under. And if we can uncover how all of these really work, the laws that govern them, right? The laws that they operate under through reason and observation, not using old traditional or mythical or spiritual explanations for why things are the way they are, but we can actually really understand them, right? Then we can actually change these environments. And this is one of the great beliefs, and this is the great optimistic belief of the Enlightenment, and it almost all of America's and Europe's, progressive social change movements have this idea. The great reform movements of the early 19th century and the early 20th century, right, is that the environment shapes the individual. Change the environment, you change the individual, right? And if a person lives under tyranny or in poverty or someplace where there's resource deprivation or any of these sort of things, right, we're going to yield a less capable, less moral, less hardworking or whatever individual. And if we can figure out where things work best and expose the individual to that sort of society, the opposite will happen. We'll improve the human condition. And the reason why this is more optimistic than what came before is because embedded in traditional explanations, whether they were religious or just sort of long-standing folklore or just, the way people say, hey, that's just the way it is, the king is the king, is because they were presented as unchangeable. Things were the way they were because you can't change them, right? This is how God made them or the universe made them, right? They're not changeable, right? They're sort of a priori, that means pre-existing realities that make things the way they are. There's a certain fatalism being built into that, a certain forced acceptance. That's why doubt leads to optimism in the Enlightenment. It undoes that. And it introduces this idea of environmentalism. And the 18th century colonists, elite colonists, especially men like Jefferson and Franklin, they love this idea. And they really run with it. It bleeds into their personal lives and to their political lives. All right, so understanding this idea of environmentalism. And I should say, it's an idea that ebbs and flows. On the one hand, we live in a post-B.F. Skinner world where we have a certain amount of appreciation for this sort of environmentalism. But we also live in a post-Watson and Crick world, right? And a new sort of arguments of determinism are starting to enter our intellectual lexicon. So this is a social cultural reality that is not yet resolved, that is still an idea that is still in flux. But the Enlightenment side is 100% on the idea of this environmentalism. So who are the men of the Enlightenment? We're going to look at a couple of them just so we can kind of say what exactly they're looking at. How would this work? The first one I always talk about, if we talk about the Enlightenment, is really the first great thinker of the Enlightenment. And in some ways, he's an atypical Enlightenment figure. He's Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton. Modern physics, and sometimes people try to diminish the brilliance of Newton. As I always tell you, quantum mechanics are all well and good, but the world you and I live in and the way this building is standing and that this camera is working all goes back to Newton. Newtonian physics and the math he created, calculus. And yes, I know Leibniz created it at the exact same time over in Germany, but they didn't do it together. But nonetheless, Newton put it to a more practical application of creating the Newtonian physical world, right? And a way to understand that. And, we can never really diminish the brilliance of Isaac Newton. Our kids still study his physics when they're in high school. And his math when they get to college. There's no way around them. And what makes him interesting is, as a first Enlightenment figure, is that he's a devout Puritan, a believer in predestination, a believer in an absolute active creator God. And we'll get back to how this works for him, why he was still able to be this kind of a thinker and have these ideas. What are his ideas? Well, he observed the universe, created math, looked at nature, and formulated several of the most important explanations for how things move and what makes them move and the directions they will travel in our universe, in our everyday world and in the greater world, right? His 3 laws of motion, explaining the effects of inertia and force, right? And his laws of gravitation that establish an absolute math for how things will fall. And when we combine all these, not only do we sort of uncover these amazing, consistent laws that govern all movement and all non-movement, right, in our world, structural and sort of temporal, right? But it also gives us ability to predict how things will move, predict how things will work. It gives us power, a whole new way to operate in this world, taking what we learned from reason, math, and observation, establishing these laws, unpacking them from what was before a great mystery of the universe and of nature, and then allowing men and women and all of human society to make predictions, correct predictions on what will happen. And I mean, this changes the mechanical world. This gives birth to a whole new level of technique. Its practical applications, as well as its sort of intellectual import, can't be understated. They go hand in hand. And, after Newton, people look at this. And his books, Principia, it is an international sensation. Everyone knows Newton. Every intellectual becomes familiar with what it is that Newton has kind of laid out here. And what he has laid out is that the world is knowable, predictable, operates according to specific natural laws, and not according to the whims of fate or some gods. Now the way he reconciled this with his God is he sort of has that watchmaker attitude, like that he said, the fact that all these laws seem to already exist, right? That everything seems to have to fit to these already pre-existing natural laws that he discovered not through prayer and meditation, mind you, or through scripture, but rather through observation, reason, and math. But nonetheless, the fact that they seem to exist suggested to him that only a creator God could have put them in place. That to him it was reaffirming, right? It reaffirmed his belief in an orderly, predictable, rational God, which is very appealing to the Puritans. Out of this, though, the people who make the most out of Newton are not Puritans, and they're not of a religious bent at all. Some of them will be somewhat anti-religious, some will be neutral religious, some will be religious, but it won't really, this aspect of knowledge won't really feed that part of them. And as I said, its import isn't just to people of science, although it will be. There will be many people who will build on Newton's observations and predictions and math, right, in order to build better tools, make new inventions, right, understand science better. That part of Newton and the Enlightenment is sound and clear. But there's other people who import it into other aspects. They say, well, if this is true about the natural world and movement, isn't it also true about our political world, about the social economic world? Can I use this same technique, using observation and math and reason, to understand the natural laws of our everyday world, our social world, and be able to predict how things could work better, to manipulate them and how they work better? And the real key guy there's many guys who fall under this category, both French and English and Scottish. The only one I want to talk about here, to keep it focused, is the one that actually probably mattered the most to American intellectuals. Certainly the American intellectuals who will be at the political forefront of leading the American Revolution, and that's John Locke. John Locke. In 1690, he publishes a foundational work called The Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And he lays the groundwork in this for two ideas that will be very important to the Enlightenment as a whole, specifically the political revolutionary side of the Enlightenment in America in the specifics, and also in France and in other places later. The first idea is this, and it's a political one. And basically what he argues is rational representative government, government that is elected by the people to represent them, will actually create the best political environment, right? You'll create the best political environment that will foster moral, stable, and productive individual citizens, all right? So he has this idea that representational government, a constitutional representational government, right, that is rational and elected by the people themselves, will actually lead to a society, will create a political environment, right, will shape the political environment so that the citizens themselves will be more productive, moral, right, and stable. And Locke doesn't just make this argument, or at least he doesn't just defend this argument saying, I think this is more moral or it's better. What he does is he looks at nature. He has all these different, his observations of nature and the natural world, right? And he had traveled some. He'd actually been to the Carolinas. He had some ideas about what the world of nature looked like and budding civilizations, right? And what he would say is he says that what he would talk about humans in a state of nature. He'd say man, he did say man. But for us, for our class, we could say a human being in a state of nature possesses the most individual liberty. And when left to his own devices, right, that man and humans are naturally liberty-loving, right? We have a desire to be liberty. And liberty is just the ability to choose to do as you want, right? When all other restrictions are moved, we will choose to do what we want more often than we will choose to follow someone else. And what he said is that knowing that that is man in its natural state, or humans in their natural state, we have to create a government, a style of government that promotes the most liberty, right, that increases the most liberty, and yet still operates in the real world, in civilization, right? We can't live in a state of nature. Locke understood that. He's not an anarchist, right? He's actually very into rigorous government. And so he looks and he says, well, what sort of government promotes the most liberty, yet at the same time is stable, right? Can operate in this growing imperial world, right? Because he's a proud Englishman. He's part of the empire. He's an educated elite member. And what he comes up with is this sort of representational government. Now, I should say, he doesn't support pure democracy. He actually likes monarchy. In fact, what he argues for is a constitutionally limited monarchy aided by a very vibrant representative body, democratically elected representative body with a constitution that ensures certain traditional liberties, right, that neither Parliament nor, he doesn't say Parliament specifically, but the legislature or a monarch can transgress, right? So there's some things that are above the law that we all possess. And as long as this government is committed to preserving those, that maximizes liberty. And as long as we have a representative component as well, that we allow people to participate rationally, they'll be rational. We'll have a more rational society. This is not surprising. This is what he comes up with, since this is exactly what England had just done in 1689, right? This is what the Glorious Revolution is. They bring in William and Mary, and they chase out James II, and they create this new constitutional monarchy with a Bill of Rights that enshrines traditional liberties, says the monarch can't transgress them, and he has to work with Parliament, right? I mean, in some ways, Locke is merely adding intellectual legitimacy to the political realities that he already found himself in. He's a supporter. However, over the years, these ideas about representational government being the essence of preserving liberty and liberty having certain guaranteed rights that must be both constitutionally and politically upheld, because that is closer to the observable world of nature, how we really are, and will produce the best people. I mean, that has great, great, great import among the revolutionary leaders. Certainly a certain cadre of them too, and I would argue the most influential as we move from the Continental Congress all the way through the Federal Union, right, the creation of the Constitution. I should also say, backing up a little bit here about the Enlightenment, these guys weren't all scientists. In fact, most of them aren't scientists at all. You know, Locke's observations of nature, yeah, he finds exactly what he already wanted to see. We should be very clear about this. This is not the scientific method, right? Most of these guys, from Rousseau to Locke to Montesquieu to Voltaire, right? They're not scientists. They're not Darwin looking at nature, right? The scientific method, right, is deductive reasoning, right? It is eliminating all other possibilities and establishing, a singular answer through repeatable, measurable results, right? That you can repeat them and you can measure them over and over. They're always true. That's the connection between reason and observation, and it's painstaking, right? And it borrows from the Enlightenment, this idea of doubt and observation and reason, but is far more rigorous. Newton falls into that category, in spite of the fact that he's more religious, but he's more in that line. Locke, I mean, honestly, anybody who observes nature and finds it liberty-loving has not taken a very good look at nature or has never watched the Animal Planet channel, right? Nature is not full of liberty, it's full of tyranny, right? So I just want to bring this aside that much of the reasoning is inductive reasoning or a certain amount of analogical, right? He makes analogies in his reasoning. What matters for the Enlightenment is this idea of questioning what came before and looking for answers somewhere else other than in tradition or in folklore or religion, and this idea of environmentalism, right? All of that is in Locke, which brings me to the second contribution he makes, and that is a specific type of religion. The religion he creates, well, he doesn't actually create it, and people build on things he said, and then they give it a name, and they call it Deism. Deism is the name of this religion, and it's, a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, both in the colonies and certainly in France and in England, they come across somewhat hostile to religion. In fact, many of them could be called atheists, right? What they say challenges certain traditional aspects of religion that could get you in big trouble. It is illegal everywhere in the Western world to be openly atheistic, right? In some places, it could cost you your life, right? So even in the 18th century. So these guys need some intellectual cover, right, in order to say what they want to say. And Locke puts forth this idea that is later called deism, and it's embraced, and Jefferson and Ben Franklin, the Americans, will really embrace this idea. They become probably its greatest proponents. And it's this idea that the deists would say, all right, there is a God, and God created the whole universe, right? And he created the laws that govern it, kind of that almost Newtonian idea. But after he created it, he never, ever again interferes in how it runs. Never. He does not interact with us through miracles, or he doesn't cause things to happen. He merely set up the natural laws and allows them to happen, right? And within it, there's also free will for humans, right? So everything that happens, does not happen because of divine intervention, right? So that God is sort of outside of his creation, and the deists are kind of quiet about, yes, when you die, and your soul goes back to God, that's when, God becomes part of this story again. But as far as this world, right, God created everything. They kind of put forth this idea of this creator God. It's almost an Aristotelian model of this sort of creator God. But the rules that govern it, the laws that we operate within and the things that happen, God doesn't interfere with those. They happen because of other reasons. And more importantly, it comes with understanding this world that God created. Though God created it, the key to understanding it is not through meditation. It is not through prayer or seeking miracles or revelation. For the deist, it's through the Enlightenment method. The way to understand this created world of God is actually using, God-given human reason, observation, and math. You put those together, empirical observation, reason, and math, that's how we uncover and unpack and understand the created world of God. It's actually a pretty clever religion for them to put forth. And, they would subscribe. They subscribed to the basic tenets of Christian morality, right? They didn't argue they felt that morality was upheld by natural law. Almost all of them will argue that. And they remain nominally Christians, but it really gives them intellectual and legal cover to challenge some pretty powerful and long-standing ideas from kingship to creation, right? This idea of deism, and that comes out of Locke. The American example. You know, the best American example is, of course, Benjamin Franklin. You know, Benjamin Franklin is America's Leonardo da Vinci, except he's better because he's also a great diplomat. You know, and he didn't just draw up inventions, he actually invents them, right? We actually get them. And, you know, Franklin is a great story. You know, Franklin, he's born in 1706 in Boston to a devout Puritan family. And at the age of 17, he leaves. He leaves. And he goes to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, because it's a large, dynamic city, it's larger and wealthier than Boston at this time. It's got this Quaker heritage of tolerance. It is a far more tolerant and dynamic and intellectually stimulating city for a man like Franklin at the age of 17, and he's really industrious. He sets up a printing press. He writes his own books, which become very popular, you know, the Poor Richard's Almanac. And by the time, and he's involved in several other economic pursuits. He becomes the colonial postmaster for the British Empire because he's really smart. He can do lots of things at the same time. At the age of 42, he's actually made a lot of money. He's a wealthy, self-made man, and he retires. And he dedicates the rest of his life to the pursuit of scientific and political knowledge and the dispersing of that knowledge and the sharing of that knowledge and the applying of that knowledge to human social betterment, particularly of people in the colonies. You know, he's one of the first leaders to have this passionate sense of belonging to something different here in the colonies, that the colonies, especially Philadelphia, but the colonies, the American colonies as a whole, he's one of our first nationalist thinkers, right? Franklin thinks of himself, maybe not as an American, but as being something distinct here in this culture. And he wants to not only sell and celebrate this culture, he wants to improve it using this incredible brain that he has and these Enlightenment techniques. And, you know, listen, we know he thought that all knowledge was worthwhile and all knowledge was useful and all knowledge should be harnessed to the betterment of human society. And Franklin means that. Like, he really does dedicate his life to this, and well, to other things. You know, and he's an inventor, as we know. He invents bifocal glasses, or a type of bifocals, right? He discovers that lightning is electricity, right? He doesn't discover lightning, right? But he discovers lightning is electricity and actually invents the first useful lightning rod. And this design is used on buildings and ships, right, to protect them from, you know, being destroyed by lightning, which was a huge problem during that time. You know, some people wonder, like, what was the big deal about discovering the connection between lightning and electricity? And he did some early studies on electricity and understood how it worked, understood grounding, right? He really is both politically and scientifically and mechanically savvy. And he's business savvy. But what he also does that I like about Franklin, what makes him so important to the American aspect of this, is his transcontinental aspect, right? He did things to make sure that this information was spread across the colonies and shared. One of the first things he does is he creates his own university. He gets other wealthy benefactors, and, you know, in the 1750s, in Philadelphia, he makes the University of Philadelphia, which becomes the very prestigious University of Pennsylvania today. And what's great is, you know, Harvard and Yale, who'd certainly broadened their curriculum by the 18th century, but, you know, they were founded for specific religious reasons of training new world ministers, right? Franklin makes sure from the very beginning that the University of Philadelphia, eventually Pennsylvania, has this very broad global perspective about learning, using the knowledge that's coming from Europe and being created by men like himself, taking that knowledge and then putting it back out in publications and in sharing, right, and in teaching. And the curriculum he puts forth is one that really focuses heavily on science, history, logic, geography, and of course mathematics. I mean, all the sort of backbones of the Enlightenment. He had been a postmaster general. He'll revive that role. And in the early national period, he'll understand that creating a system that spreads writing around quickly and easily among all the people, the colonies, and then the nation is one of the main ways, communication, to tie this nation together. And he does a bunch of other things, but he also creates the American Philosophical Society. And the American Philosophical Society is not a collection of philosophers. It's actually a collection of amateur natural scientists. You know, men like the Bartrams and Franklin himself and other elite members of both plantation society and certainly the seaboard societies, they engaged in science. They went out and observed things. They did experiments. You know, they were educated guys, and in some ways they were almost hobbyists. And what Franklin said is, we have to create a national organization that brings them together. We review and share what we're learning, and then we disperse it with some authority and some sense of purpose, right? Sort of creating an American kind of research model, right, of this sort of national view of the learning and the investigations done by this elite culture, to not leave it all isolated, right? To bring it together in a centralized model, make it of value, and then disperse it. And that's very much at the heart of what Franklin gives. It's very much at the heart of what the Enlightenment gives. So, some final thoughts about this Enlightenment culture. One, as I said before, it's a minority culture. We have to actually accept that, right? And as a matter of fact, it's not just all the elites. It's a minority among a minority, right? It's a smaller portion of the elites who really participate in this. However, it's a top-down society at this time. The work and the ideas of the elites did have a more than trickle-down, a somewhat cascade-down in some effect, relationship with the rest of colonial society, right? Men like Franklin was a celebrity in his own time, not just among colonial elites, right? Among commoners. People knew Ben Franklin. The French knew Ben Franklin before he got there, right? People know him. So there's a certain amount of celebrity that goes with this, and these were their celebrities, and even before the Revolution, and certainly more so after the Revolution. So understanding this part of it does argue a little bit for why it's important. Now, I want to add a little bit more to this, because it helps to have an understanding of the historical profession. There was a time, long ago, where knowing the intellectual traditions of the Enlightenment figures, particularly Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and which of the founding fathers and which of the elite members of the Revolution had read them and owned them, right? And you would track this intellectual tradition, and you would firmly place the American Revolution and also the French Revolution, you would firmly place it as an expression of this intellectual historical tradition. Well, the historical profession really moved away from that. Over the years, and I would say, I don't know when to put a beginning on it, but I would imagine, I'm pretty sure after World War II, and certainly into the 60s, and even in modern times, there's been a diminution of the value of the Enlightenment to the Revolution. And this has happened for a couple of reasons. One, improvement in historical method and focus. Instead of only looking at what was once called great man history or sort of great intellectual history, right, we've broadened our view, because most of the people aren't these people. Most of the people who live, fight, and die in the Revolution and give up their security in order to push forward these ideals are not part of the Enlightenment, haven't read these works, and are not Franklin or Jefferson. And this is true for all of history, that trying to capture the culture and the mindset and the identity of the masses, of these larger groups, and recreate them and make them the center of the story, the driving part of the historical narrative, has been a part of, probably the central part of the historical project, certainly here in America and in Europe as well, for the last 40, 50 years. And one of the casualties in that is a certain amount of intellectual history. I should also add that, like all history, including this lecture and anything else you see, there are biases that are implied, that those who do history or write any sort of observation focus on things that matter to them, that reflect their morality, their political morality and sensibilities, their philosophy, their interest. And there's been a political shift, right? That this sort of look at the masses, the commoners, the subaltern, right? It reflects a political sensibility moving away from elitism to a more democratic model. And that is certainly post-1960s a very passionate and important part of history. And as I said, it's been aided by wonderful historical tools and techniques. All of that is well and good. But what I would say that we have to come back to, everything else they add, there's no one thing that tells the whole story. But I think that you cannot really understand the revolution without understanding the role of the Enlightenment and what it meant. Whether or not the colonies would have broken away from England without the Enlightenment. I mean, that's hard to say without a time machine, but I believe that to be true, right? They were growing economically different. There were these sort of dichotomies that we've talked about before about self-interest versus imperial interest. That a colonial revolution happens isn't really all that startling in history. However, I have to say that the sort of society they created after they broke away, the arguments they made for why they broke away, and what they have meant as they forged the first national government and then the federal union, if it doesn't owe directly to the thinking of specific Enlightenment historians, it beyond a shadow of a doubt owes a debt to the spirit of the Enlightenment, which imbued many of our elite early national leaders. Thank you.